talking about whether or not you are putting up with too much in your relationship. And I love this question because it's one of my favorite topics, because there is such a huge discrepancy between what one woman thinks is putting up with too much versus another. And it's something that we talk about a lot over in Relationships Redone, and those are always really great conversations. So before I get started with it, as always, I want to start by saying that if you are in a physically abusive relationship or feel unsafe in any way, none of what I'm about to say applies to you. Instead, I'd want you to reach out to someone local to your area to get help on how to remove yourself from that relationship in a safe way. Okay, now let's talk about this question. How do you know if you're putting up with too much from your partner? And the reason that this is such a huge thing is because all of us grew up with very different relationship schools. Basically your childhood is your relationship school, just like I believe it's Dave Ramsey who says that your childhood is also your money school, right? So how we saw relationships demonstrated to us as children really has a huge impact on how we then perceive what a healthy relationship should look like. And in some cases, you may have grown up and really been around dysfunctional relationships, and you might now be acting in a way that you act in your relationship because you're trying to do the opposite of what you saw going on in your parents' relationship, for example. But that doesn't always mean, so doing the opposite of what you've seen does not always mean that it's going to be healthy. So what we see is these sort of two ends of the spectrum when it comes to essentially how much grace you apply to your relationship. So at the one end of the spectrum, we have women who do put up with too much. So these are women who, in my book, When Marriage Needs a Miracle, these are the women who I would call the enabler personality type. So they offer too much grace. And the reason that the enabler personality type is such a tricky one, if it's you, is because it feels like it's coming from a place of love, or it often feels like that. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So what's really interesting, speaking of Dave Ramsey, because as you may or may not know, Rachel Cruz is Dave Ramsey's daughter. And her book, I believe it's called Know Yourself, Know Your Money. It's been around for a few years. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. She actually talks about the grace scale when it comes to money. And I found that really interesting because often when people join my program, Relationships Redone, they end up making more money as well. So even though the focus of the program initially is on relationship stuff, we then move on to prosperity stuff later. But the focus of it is on relationship stuff. But how you do anything is how you do everything, right? So if you are someone who is really far to the one end of the spectrum when it comes to applying a lot of grace in your relationship, and I'll tell you a little bit about what that might look like for you. But if that's you, you probably also apply a lot of grace, maybe too much grace, when it comes to your finances. And so what you start to see as you step into, or if you decide to step into this sort of new version of yourself that comes from a much more confident place, is some of the excuses you make for your partner, or some of the excuses you make for poor financial habits, start to go away, and you stop making those excuses, and then start expecting more in terms of how you're treated, but also expecting more in terms of what you want your financial future to look like. So believe it or not, all of these things are very much interconnected, which is why it's so important to understand these parts of you so that the future can start to look very different than the past, if indeed your past relationship or the relationship you're currently in isn't looking how you want it to look. So let's talk about what that enabler personality type looks like. So if you give your partner too much grace, some key signs of that would be that you make excuses for them over and over and over again. You might also lie to others about them. So, perhaps if your partner decides on Mother's Day that he's just not, or she's just not coming with you to the Mother's Day brunch that your family planned, someone who applies a little bit too much grace might lie to everybody at the brunch and say, oh, he was really sick. When, of course, deep down, you might feel really hurt that he's made this decision not to come just because he's in a bad mood or she's in a bad mood or whatever. And so people who are enablers often protect their partner from the judgment of others and end up making themselves feel quite hurt in the meantime. Often people who are this personality type, the type who apply too much grace, they are someone who would be considered anxiously attached. And what that means is there's this deep-rooted fear in you that if you cause conflict, if you kind of broach a subject that your partner isn't going to like or isn't going to like the way that you broach the subject, that maybe your partner would leave. And often, when we dig into this kind of stuff, people will say, well, I don't actually think he would leave, if I got mad at him. But deep down, this is where it's coming from. It feels like I said, it feels like it's coming from a place of, I just want to keep the peace. But often where it's coming from, more often than not, it's coming from a place of, I really, really don't like conflict. And so because I'm scared of conflict or because I'm scared of his reaction to my opinion or to my feelings, I'm just going to leave it and then make excuses for his behavior. Someone who gives their partner too much grace often also can fall into the people-pleasing category. So this is somebody who often will put themselves on the bottom of the priority list at all times. So maybe you do too much for a lot of people, including your partner. Maybe you overcommit, and then you find yourself with not enough time for yourself. So maybe you've been really wanting to get better habits around going to the gym, but it feels like you just can't get there because you're always up late, maybe making lunch for your school lunches for your teenage kids, or which, by the way, they can make their own lunches when they're teenagers. Or maybe you're, up late helping your child with homework because they forgot to get it done early. And so instead of being able to go to bed on time, you stay up until midnight helping your child with a project that was really their responsibility to do. So this is the people pleaser type, and it applies, of course, it's going to apply in your marriage, but you'll see yourself behaving in this way in other areas of your life as well. So with other areas of your family, maybe, whether it's your grown siblings, your parents even, and certainly at work as well. You're the person that people say, oh, just give it to her, she'll get it done. And you end up working late or whatever, right? So that is that people pleaser mentality. And in your relationship, as I said, it shows up as anxious attachment. Another example, so I use the Mother's Day example, but in, the most extreme cases, if you're someone who provides too much grace to your partner, you will often feel that you are walked on, or that you're really taken advantage of by your partner, by other family members. And it might often feel like a lot of what you do for others, people wouldn't do for you. So again, and we had a lot of discussions around this around Mother's Day, where, I did a poll on Instagram around how people felt about their Mother's Day. And I think it was about 32%, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it was about 32% of them, of you out there said that you felt loved and adored beyond measure. But what that of course means is that there's 68% of people who either have come to not expect anything and they're saying, that's okay, I'm fine, I don't need anyone to make a fuss over me. Or they're saying, my partner or my family didn't put very much effort in. Or they're saying, I was extremely hurt by the way that turned out. So if you're on this too much grace end of the spectrum, and that was you, I'm guessing this is also a pattern where you see this on your birthday. You don't feel like people put much effort in, or maybe, you know, around Christmas time, you feel like you do all the work and you don't get very much help. This is what it looks like when you are giving too much grace in your life, and certainly within your marriage, where you end up enabling your partner for many, many years to kind of dismiss you, and in the most extreme cases, treat you really terribly. So as I said in an email that went out today around some of the messages, you know, women will often send me screen captures of text messaging conversations from their extreme partners. And sometimes it's just insane to me the way that people, you know, their husbands or partners are messaging them, and that they would ever put any of those words in writing. It just is disgusting, to be quite frank. And then for women to make excuses around it, you know, well, his dad was really like that, and I know he doesn't mean it, or he just gets really stressed out, or, you know, one I still hear a lot of is COVID was really hard on our marriage. But you know what? COVID was years ago now, and it's time for people to stop using that as an excuse for why all of these problems exist. You have to face the problems in order for the problems to be resolved. So that's the one end of the spectrum, or this grace scale, as Rachel Cruz calls it. Now, the other end of the spectrum is if you are one of those women who doesn't apply enough grace to their marriage or to their husband or partner. And so this is the person who is very rigid, gets mad about everything. So this would often look like somebody who has very defined or strict personal rules and applies a lot of judgment to others who don't follow them. And so in some cases, you know, silly but meaningful examples are, this is the person who will say, you know, I don't like the way that he loads the dishwasher, and I have to tell him every single time to change it, right? And or, you know, they say, well, my partner, I think it's really important that I always know where my husband is. And then when their husband is late getting home from work by, say, 10 minutes or something, they'll yell at them when they come in the door, like, why didn't you call me? You know, you're late for supper, kind of thing. So that's a person who is on the other end of the spectrum, and their response to what they deem to be mistakes is at that extreme end. And that's a really difficult person to live with. So you might be that person, you might recognize yourself in that description, or maybe you live with a partner who's like that. Either way, if you live with a partner who's like that, it is no surprise to you that this is a very difficult person to live with. And what it does to your relationship, of course, is it destroys the trust in your relationship. It destroys the sense of freedom and safety. And of course, a healthy relationship is based on freedom and safety. And that means I need to be free to be myself in the relationship, and I need to feel that you're going to love me regardless, that I am safe to be myself, and I'm free to build a life that feels good to me. And so the really healthy relationships are the relationships where you're somewhere in the middle of these two extremes of very little grace versus, a lot of grace versus very little grace. Because in the middle is where you get to be yourself. You have boundaries and confidence around how you expect to be treated. And I'll tell you, when your boundaries are based in confidence, and I often say this, any of my clients will tell you, oh my gosh, she says this all the time. You need to mean it, okay? So confidence is about, I really mean it. This boundary I have around how I'm going to be treated is something that I stick to. And that doesn't mean a rigid rule around you need to always call if you're going to be 10 minutes late, but there might be a rigid rule around how you're spoken to, and a lot of grace given around, oh, you were 10 minutes late? That's okay. Glad you're here safely. Or you're an hour late. Again, maybe it would have been nice if you called, but maybe the response to it isn't so extreme. So when people are in that middle place, people have the ability to make reasonable mistakes, because again, this is the nature of the human condition. So when you're in a relationship, relationships are spiritual assignments. So when someone is treating you poorly, it's telling you something about them for sure, because anyone who treats somebody else poorly, it's a them thing. Okay, people treat others basically how they feel about themselves. But when you apply too much grace to it, when you enable that bad behavior, that's also telling you something about yourself. It's telling you that at your root, at your core, your energy is saying, I don't really deserve more than this. Or I'm so fearful of what your response to me will be that I would rather be treated poorly than deal with your response. So in those cases, the safety from your relationship is missing. So at either end of the spectrum, if you're an enabler, it's because you're not feeling safe to be yourself. You're not feeling safe to have expectations around how you're treated. If you apply too little grace to your partner when he or she makes mistakes, that's also about, first of all, you're creating a lack of safety in the relationship. You're creating exactly what you don't want. But it's also a control mechanism, right? Where you're trying to control their behavior. You're trying to take your judgments and apply it to them. But likely, if you apply very little grace to your partner's mistakes, you probably grew up in a situation where very little grace was given to you when you made mistakes. So you live in this world of everything needs to be perfect, or else there's going to be trouble. And that's not a great way for you to live for yourself either. So people who are really hard on others, it's usually because they're also hard on themselves, which unfortunately for a lot of people, makes it easy to justify being really difficult or really approaching other people's mistakes with a lot of judgment and in some cases emotional dysregulation and that sort of thing. I guess I'd like to close just by saying that grace in a healthy way comes from confidence. So this is never about at the extreme. So often people think, well, if he yells at me, I'm going to yell back. But that doesn't come from confidence. That comes from defensiveness. That comes from a sense of retaliation. It doesn't feel good. It's not a high vibration. It's not going to get you what you want. And this is really the point of either end of this spectrum, is that all of us enter our marriage wanting love and safety and harmony and partnership. We want someone who's our person to go through life with, someone who's going to love us unconditionally, and help us and support us and add joy and love into our day. When we are at either end of this spectrum, what we end up doing is creating exactly what we don't want in our marriage. So if you're enabling your partner to treat you poorly and you think you're doing it from a place of harmony, I guarantee you that you will wake up, if you haven't already, one day you're going to feel resentful. You're going to feel like a lot of the issues in your marriage have never been resolved. As women get older, as our kids grow up, we step into a version of ourselves that wants a life that feels good to us. And when we're so busy with kids, it's easy to sort of set that aside at times and put all of our attention on our kids and very little attention on our marriage. And as many of you have likely realized, that doesn't do anybody any favors. So if that's where you're at, if you're at that end of the spectrum and you've woken up and realized I've been enabling my partner to treat me poorly or to not help out, and it's making me really resentful all of these years, and now you need to change that, I'm going to tell you, it doesn't, first of all, it won't change overnight, but it doesn't change until you change it. So we can't look at our partner and blame them. If we're the enabler, we can't look at our partner and place all the blame there in terms of where things with the marriage are at. Because I'll tell you, what your partner's been doing is they've been treating you exactly the same way that you've been treating you. And if you're on the other end of the spectrum and you are frustrated with your partner and judging them and getting angry with them often, I promise you, getting angry and being overly critical and trying to control what they do and how they do it, as you've seen, doesn't work. It's not going to create the happiness in your marriage that you're really after. And it's certainly not going to make you feel supported and fulfilled by that person, because nobody ever wants to be controlled and nobody ever wants to be told what to do and how to do it. So learning that middle ground where you're giving grace, where you're offering support and forgiveness at an appropriate level is key to creating a marriage and a life that you love to live. And I will see you next time.
If you've been struggling in your relationship, if you feel like you've lost yourself and you'd like to figure things out and really step into the happiness and prosperity that the universe wants for you, click the link below, join our community over in the Facebook group, Relationship Answers for Women. There's also a link to download my best-selling book, When Marriage Needs a Miracle, absolutely free. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for being here.